Demons, curses, mad scientists, the occult. Throughout history, mankind has searched for power and occasionally claimed to find it, sometimes through ritual, sometimes through belief, and sometimes through objects. Occult artifacts don't always look unusual. That's kind of the problem, because the stories attached to them are objects that are said to influence events, affect people, change outcomes. Now, most of these are dismissed as superstition, misinterpretation, coincidence, which would be reassuring if the same kinds of stories didn't keep appearing across different objects, different places, different time periods, because every so often, an artifact doesn't just carry a legend, it carries a pattern of strange behavior, unexplained events, people who don't come away unchanged. Now, that doesn't prove anything, but it does raise an uncomfortable question. If the same patterns keep repeating, at what point do you stop calling it coincidence and start calling it something else? These are some of the most infamous occult artifacts in human history, and the stories that refuse to leave them alone. Number 1, the Codex Gigas, the Devil's Bible. The largest medieval manuscript ever discovered isn't just known for its size, it's known for how it was made. The Codex Gigas dates back to the early 13th century, created in a Benedictine monastery in what is now the Czech Republic. It contains over 300 pages of text, including the entire Latin Bible, medical treatises, historical records, and something else. Full-page illustrations of demons, most notably, a single towering image of the devil himself, taking up an entire page, which, for a religious manuscript, is already slightly unusual, but the real story isn't what's inside the book. It's how it was written. According to legend, the monk responsible for creating it had broken his vows and was sentenced to be walled up alive. To avoid this, he made a promise. He would create a book containing all human knowledge in a single night, an impossible task. So he turned to something or someone else for help. Not God, but the devil itself, in exchange for his soul. Now, obviously, that's just a legend, but here's where it becomes slightly less comfortable. Analysis of the manuscript shows that it was, in fact, written by a single person. The handwriting remains almost perfectly consistent throughout, from the first page to the last, which wouldn't be unusual if the book were small. But the Codex Gigas is over 90 centimeters tall, weighs around 75 kilograms, and would have taken decades to complete. Not hours, decades, with no visible change in style, no deterioration, no signs of fatigue, which suggests something equally strange. Not that it was written in a single night, but that one person worked on this thing for an extremely long time, without ever slipping, which raises a different kind of question. Not whether the legend is true, but why a monk would spend decades of his life creating a book like this, and then fill it with something that looks like that, because whatever its origin, the Codex Gigas isn't just a religious text, it's a contradiction. Number 2, the Hexam heads. Not all occult artifacts come from ancient history. Some just turn up. In 1971, in the town of Hexam in Northumberland, 2 small stone heads were discovered buried in a garden, roughly the size of a fist, carved from stone, with crude, almost distorted human features. At first, they didn't seem particularly important, just odd. So they were brought inside. And that's when things started to change. Objects began moving on their own, furniture would shift overnight, doors would open and close. The family reported hearing something moving through the house when no one else was there. Then came the animals. One of the daughters claimed she saw a creature in her room, something with the shape of a man, but not quite right. Hairy, large, watching. Later, neighbors began reporting similar things. Descriptions varied, but the pattern didn't. A presence in the house, something moving at night, something attached to the heads. Now, eventually, the artifacts were taken away for investigation, and the activity stopped, almost immediately, which should make this easy to explain. Remove the objects, remove the problem. Except for one detail. When the heads were later returned to another home, the disturbances reportedly started again, and then stopped when they disappeared. To this day, no one is entirely sure where they are, which might not mean anything, but it does leave a slightly uncomfortable possibility that whatever people thought they experienced wasn't tied to a place. It was tied to the objects themselves. Number 3, the Ring of Solomon. Some occult artifacts aren't feared because of what they've done, but because of what they're said to control. The Ring of Solomon is one of the oldest examples, a legendary object attributed to King Solomon, a ruler of ancient Israel, traditionally dated to around the 10th century BCE. He's remembered as a king associated with wisdom, judgment, and the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. which is where things start to become less straightforward. Because alongside the historical accounts, there's another version of Solomon, one that appears across Jewish, Islamic, and later occult traditions. According to these accounts, the ring wasn't symbolic. It was functional, engraved with a divine seal. It supposedly granted him authority over demons, not protection from them, authority. He could summon them, command them, force them to obey. Some texts even claim he used them to build the first temple, which is a very specific detail to keep appearing in different sources. Now, there's no physical version of the ring that can be verified today, but references to it show up repeatedly, often with the same core idea: that something existed which allowed a human being to exert control over non-human entities. And that's where it becomes slightly more interesting, because most occult artifacts are described as dangerous, unpredictable, difficult to control. This one isn't. It's described as precise, deliberate, almost administrative, as if whatever it interacted with followed rules. Now, whether any of that is true is another question. But the persistence of the idea is harder to ignore, because across centuries, completely different cultures kept arriving at the same conclusion: that if something like this existed, it wouldn't just be powerful, it would redefine who or what is actually in control. Number 4, the Mirror of Khazarrev. Most occult artifacts come from ancient history, or at least ancient belief systems. This one doesn't. The Mirror of Khazarrev comes from the Soviet Union, mid-20th century, and unlike most entries on this list, it wasn't discovered, it was built. Named after astrophysicist Nikolai Kozyrev, who proposed that time itself wasn't just a measurement, but a physical force, something that could be directed, focused, even manipulated. To test this idea, researchers constructed large curved structures made of reflective metal, designed to concentrate what Kozyrev believed was the flow of time. Participants would sit inside them and wait. What they reported wasn't consistent, but it also wasn't random. Some described heightened perception, an awareness of things they shouldn't be able to sense. Others reported vivid visions, scenes from the past, or possible futures. And then there were the more difficult accounts to explain, people claiming they could transmit thoughts, receive information, or briefly experience events that hadn't happened yet. Now, none of this is widely accepted as science, and the experiments themselves are hard to verify. But they were conducted, documented, repeated, which makes this slightly different from a typical occult artifact. Because this wasn't something ancient people believed in. This was something modern researchers tried to build, using physics and materials and theory to interact with something we don't fully understand, which raises a different kind of concern. Because if even a fraction of those reports were accurate, then the question isn't whether the mirror worked. It's what exactly it was interacting with, and whether it was ever supposed to be accessed in the first place. Number 5, the Book of Thoth. Some occult artifacts aren't dangerous because of what they do, but because of what they let you understand. The Book of Thoth is one of the oldest examples of that idea, originating in ancient Egyptian mythology. It's said to have been written by Thoth himself, the god of writing, magic, and knowledge, which already sets a certain expectation. According to the stories, this wasn't just a religious text, it was something far more specific, a collection of spells and instructions that granted abilities most people were never meant to have. Understanding the language of animals, seeing beyond the natural world, even influencing reality itself. In some versions, it goes further, describing knowledge of the gods, the structure of the universe, things that once learned couldn't be unlearned. And that's where the pattern starts to appear, because nearly every account of the book comes with the same warning, that reading it doesn't just give you knowledge, it changes you. Stories describe people who sought it out, found it, and then paid for it, with madness, with loss, with things they couldn't explain. Now, there's no confirmed version of the Book of Thoth that exists today. What we have are fragments, references in texts, stories passed down and reinterpreted over time. But again, the consistency is the interesting part. Different sources, different periods, same core idea, that there are certain types of knowledge that aren't hidden to protect them. They're hidden because of what happens if you find them, which raises a slightly uncomfortable possibility that the most dangerous artifacts aren't the ones that do something to you. They're the ones that show you something you weren't supposed to see. Number 6, the Hand of Glory. Some occult artifacts weren't meant to be studied. They were meant to be used. The Hand of Glory is one of the clearest examples of that, originating in European folklore, primarily during the Middle Ages. It's exactly what it sounds like, a preserved human hand typically taken from someone who had been executed, dried, prepared, and turned into a tool, not symbolic, functional. According to the accounts, the hand would be fitted with candles, sometimes made from the fat of the same body. When lit, it was said to have a very specific effect. Anyone nearby would be rendered completely immobile, unable to move, unable to react, as if temporarily removed. In other versions, it didn't affect people directly. Instead, it allowed the person holding it to move undetected, to unlock doors, to enter homes without resistance, which is where the line between folklore and intent starts to blur. Because unlike most occult artifacts, this wasn't tied to mythological figures or ancient gods. It was tied to people, used in stories involving thieves, criminals, individuals who believed this was something that could be made and then used. Now, whether it ever worked is another question, but the level of detail is difficult to ignore. Instructions for how to create it, how to prepare it, what materials to use, all recorded, repeated, which suggests this wasn't just an idea, it was a practice. And that creates a slightly different kind of unease because it means there was a point in history where people weren't just telling stories about occult objects, they were trying to build them, and in some cases, believed they succeeded. Number 7, the Skull of Doom. The Mitchell-Hedges Crystal Skull. Some occult artifacts aren't tied to rituals or instructions, they're just there. The Skull of Doom is one of the most well-known examples. A life-sized human skull, carved entirely from clear quartz crystal. Allegedly discovered in the 1920s by Anna Mitchell-Hedges in the ruins of an ancient Mayan city. At first glance, it doesn't seem particularly unusual until you look at how it was made. The skull is anatomically detailed, precisely shaped, with a removable lower jaw. And according to early analysis, it shows no clear signs of tool marks, which would be difficult enough today, let alone nearly a century ago. Some researchers have suggested it would have taken decades to create, using techniques that don't fully explain the level of precision. Now, since its discovery, the skull has been surrounded by a range of claims. People who've spent time around it have reported visions, auditory hallucinations, a sense that the object is observing them. Others have described it as a kind of storage device, something that can hold information, memories, or something less defined. And then there's the broader theory that crystal skulls like this weren't just decorative, they were designed for a purpose we don't fully understand. Now, it's worth saying, many experts believe the skull is a much more recent creation, possibly manufactured in the 19th century using advanced tools, which should resolve the mystery, except it doesn't. Because even if the object itself isn't ancient, the reactions to it are consistent. And that's the pattern that keeps repeating. Across different artifacts, different time periods, different people, objects that, regardless of origin, seem to produce the same kinds of experiences. Which raises a final, slightly uncomfortable question. Whether the importance of these artifacts comes from where they came from, or from what people bring to them. Because either way, the outcome seems to be the same. Something happens, and we don't fully understand why. Most of these artifacts are locked away, stored, cataloged, studied at a distance. And for the most part, nothing happens. But every so often, the same kinds of stories resurface across different objects, different places, different people, which suggests one of two things. Either humans are very good at repeating the same patterns, or there's something about these objects that we still don't fully understand. And if it is the second one, then the question isn't whether they're dangerous. It's whether we were ever supposed to find them in the first place.